And so, we have the toughest choice in the world. How do we pick? Who do we pick? What do we do? We have an idea here at the Hideout. We can have it all. We can have Lori Lightfoot for mayor, and Tony Preckwinkle will be our president. And the two of them will work together to transform the city and county. So I want to thank, here's Lori Lightfoot, thank you for being here. Here's Ben Jarofsky, Mick Dumke, and this is First Tuesdays. Thank you for coming. And members of the media, please remember when we do Q&A, please let just regulars ask the questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tim. A rousing introduction as always. Everybody's still awake? All right. Great job. Thanks, Tim, and thanks to Tim for hosting First Tuesdays and Girl Talk and lots of other civic events, artistic events. We really appreciate it, Tim, and we appreciate the Hideout. Thank you very much. Still going to continue to give Tim shit for his 15-minute introductions every time, but we do appreciate him and the Hideout. All right, I'm Mick Dumke from ProPublica.
Yes, indeed, and I'm Ben Jarofsky from the Reader newspaper and from the Chicago Sun-Times Reader Cooperative podcast. Down but not out.
That's right. He's on the rise.
He's on the rise.
So I think just to refresh everybody's memory, the last time we were here, I think that was the immediate aftermath of the demise of your show at WCPT.
Yeah.
So the Phoenix has risen, right?
Yes. So they took me in the back alley and they drove a truck over me, and then they drove it back over again. But so a lot of good people, my friends at the unions and the Reader and the Sun-Times have come together. We've been doing the show now for a week. It's podcasting. Dr. D is over there, my partner in crime. So how should I say this, Dennis?
Chicago.suntimes.com/Jarofsky. Right.
You all got
Or you can Google it.
Google Ben Jarofsky, you'll find it. And so we've been on, today we had Willie Wilson and Troy LaRaviere on today's show. Very interesting show we had. Willie dropped in unannounced, but that was good. He just showed up, Lori. That's 90% of life.
Yeah.
Showing up. So anyway, yeah, I hope you guys check it out. Tuesday through Friday, 1 to 3 live, and then it's podcast. All right.
All right, so check out Ben's podcast. It's live streaming tonight. Obviously, you're here, so you don't need to watch the live stream, unless you're one of those people who goes to the baseball game and watches the whole game on the big screen, even though the real thing's in front of you. That's fine. Do your thing. All right, welcome to First Tuesdays. If you've been here before, we appreciate you returning. If you haven't been here before, thanks for coming out. We are really excited about this. We're thrilled to have Lori Lightfoot. Thanks, Lori, for joining us right off the bat.
It's my pleasure.
All right. Ben, you want to get things rolling?
All right. So I'll get things rolling. Thank you, Lori Lightfoot. And just, it's interesting to see you here. You're on stage with us. You're one of the 2 nominees. I just have to pause for a moment to reflect when I see Dennis over there in the corner, remembering that really steamy, sticky day when we were all at the Labor Day parade with Sue Garza's Labor Day parade in the 10th Ward. And I don't think a lot of people would have imagined that Lori Lightfoot would be one of the 2 candidates. So congratulations.
Thank you.
That said,
Now it gets interesting.
all right, so we had Tony Preckwinkle here, I guess it was in October. And the first question I asked Tony was the one that I've been waiting for years and years to ask her, which is why she was choosing to run now in 2018 after Ron had decided he wasn't going to run, and why didn't she run in 2014 when I was begging her to run? Now, I was not begging you to run in 2014. I didn't think of you as a mayoral candidate back then, or really up until about you. So I guess my question to you is this. I've been writing about progressive politics forever and ever and ever, and your name has never really come up as like a leader in the progressive movement, someone who would testify at city council hearings, someone that would be leading marches, etc. So I guess my first question is more a general question is, first of all, where were you during all those years and when all these important issues were being raised regarding TIFs, funding, schools, closing schools, closing clinics, et cetera, and why weren't you on the front lines?
Well, I think I was doing what, frankly, a lot of lawyers do. I was working on a lot of civil rights issues. I was raising a lot of money, for example, for the National Immigrant Justice Center. For those of you who don't know, that's a civil rights organization that represents people who are going through the Byzantine and often cruel immigration court system. I was working a lot during that time on police reform and accountability, which I think, frankly, is one of the biggest civil rights issues of our time, and making sure that not only that our communities are safe, but we're being policed in a way that's consistent with this thing called the Constitution. So that's how I've spent a lot of my time, representing folks who have been wrongfully incarcerated. I spent many years serving on the advisory board of the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern. So those are the ways in which I was manifesting, in my view, my progressive credentials, frankly, as a woman of color, as someone who suffered firsthand under the yoke of discrimination. It was important for me to be an advocate for people whose voices needed to be heard and needed a seat at the table. Under the progressive tent, there are a lot of ways in which I think we can manifest our bona fides and a lot of issues that I think fall within that. And so I haven't been shy about, frankly, using my position, using my firm's resources to really advance those causes that I care deeply about.
One of the things we have been hearing, I'm sure you have too, over the last week, is from a lot of activists, especially on police accountability issues, which you've, of course, touted as one of the things you've been working on. But we hear a lot of people stressing, she was a prosecutor. And they come right out and say, prosecutors are cops. Lori Lightfoot is a cop. How do you respond to that? Are you a cop?
Well, I think that's a wrong, kind of two-dimensional, cartoonish way of, frankly, looking at me and, frankly, other people like me. Look, I'm a kid who grew up in a low-income family that struggled hard every day and, frankly, saw firsthand how racial discrimination really can tear apart individuals, families, and communities. One of the narratives in my family is my grandmother's husband was murdered by a Klansman, and there was no thought of justice for him. I have a brother who spent most of his adult life in and out of somebody's prison. The last stint was for 17 years in federal prison. So you want somebody like me to be in the prosecutor's office, particularly the federal prosecutors who have tremendous amount of discretion to decide what gets investigated, what the emphasis is, who gets charged, who gets a break, who makes sentencing recommendations. Those institutions are going to exist whether people like me participate or not, but having somebody like me with my life experience at the table and being able to influence not only individual decisions about prosecution, but really kind of the narrative discussions about what justice looks like in an institution, in an office like that, I think it's incredibly important. Diversity matters. We have to have seats at tables of power, and we can't just yield the floor to other people whose views we don't agree with. We got to be in the room, because if we're not, our people, ours are going to get screwed.
Have you been having these conversations with people from the Black Lives Matter movement, from Black Youth Project, from other activists who've been out in the street and this stuff? You've been having these kind of conversations. Have you tried to explain your point of view? I mean, how does this work now as you're campaigning for mayor? Is there a possibility of you bringing them, into your coalition?
Look, I have been having conversations with anybody who is willing to listen, anybody who is open to a conversation. There's a lot of things that I have done, frankly, particularly with families of victims, that I think out of respect for them, I'm not going to sit there and make it look like I did something that I didn't, but I have always, throughout, particularly these last few years, when I've been in the middle of this incredibly important discussion here in Chicago, I've been looking out to lots of people and making reaching out to lots of people who have different perspectives and views on this than I do. And frankly, I think when people actually understand who I am and where I've come from and the life that I've lived, it influences their decisions about who I am. Now, we particularly in the world that we're living right now, are very quick to make very harsh judgments and demonize people who we think have a different perspective or viewpoint. We need to be about looking at ways in which we have things in common and how we can bring people together. And I think that's particularly important as we have this larger discussion across the city about the kind of future that we want to have. I'm not interested in demonizing the other side, my opponent. I'm interested in about talking to people about the possibilities for change and transformation of our city. And that has to be centered on, you can clap. That it has to be centered on how do we bring people together. I mean, we live in an incredibly segregated city. No denying that. We live in a city where it's assumed that parochial interests will trump anything else. I don't agree with that assumption that that's got to be the perpetual state of being. And I'm going to do everything I can to turn that on its head and try to bring people together.
That said, before we leave the discussion of your role in some of these cases, dealing with police officers accused of killing civilians, are there any cases that came before the police board that you regret the position you took, that you wish you were harder on the police officers? None?
No, not in the police board. I mean, if you look at the record, when I became president of the police board was holding officers accountable about 35% of the time. Over the time of my tenure, that changed to 73%. And frankly, it would have been higher, but officers started quitting before they came before the police board. So I'm very proud of my record on the police board. I think that we did very good work together. Not that there was a quota system, I hasten to add, but we worked really hard to make sure that we understood the facts of individual cases and that we were fairly and I think responsibly able to call balls and strikes. And again, I think the data really shows that there's frankly been nobody in the city that's been tougher on police reform and accountability than I have.
Well, a lot of people do dispute that. They say when you were serving at the Office of Professional Standards under former Mayor Daley, that was notoriously weak as a disciplinary mechanism on police officers. That, of course, morphed into the Independent Police Review Authority. Now it's the Civilian Officer of Police Accountability. So we've gone from OPS to IPRA to COPA. Other than the initials, what's the difference?
Well, there's a significant difference, and frankly, I think the system is far better and stronger and more independent now than it was when I was there. Look, the Office of Professional Standards was created in 1974, and it came out of a series of very public, highly charged racial beatings of prominent African Americans that former Congressman Metcalf brought to light. And frankly, in an end around what I think Metcalf and his folks really wanted to do, because at that time, the police didn't investigate anything. You got beaten up, you got killed, too bad for you. There was no investigation whatsoever. So Metcalf was pushing to have an independent entity actually take civilian complaints and do investigations. As a compromise, Richard J. Daley and Superintendent Rochford, who was the superintendent of police at the time, created the Office of Professional Standards, but it was embedded within the police department, and therein lied the problem. So when I was at OPS, it was still embedded within the police department. And I think we made great progress on a number of things. I mean, anybody who knows me and knows my record knows that one of the things I pushed strongly when I was at OPS is what's colloquially known as the lie you die rule. I came from the federal system where an officer or an agent lying, and particularly under oath or in the course of an internal investigation, was a death knell. And officers routinely lied in internal investigations at CPD. That was frankly shocking to me, given that I came from a completely different environment in the federal system. But there was a rule on the book, still there, called Rule 14, which at that time said, if you basically lie or obstruct an internal investigation, you're subject to discipline up to and including termination. It was never enforced. I made that a reality. So much so, frankly, when I left OPS, the FOP, through contract negotiations, got the city to agree to a seemingly higher standard to really prevent OPS or IAD, the Internal Affairs Division, from enforcing Rule 14. So I'm proud of the fact that I changed the nature of the conversation around lying. But still, at that time, because OPS was embedded in the police department, all we could do was make recommendations. And I'll give you an example of one case that frankly still haunts me. There was a terrible police shooting at 95th and the Dan Ryan with an officer named Alvin Weems, and maybe you know this case. There's no other way to describe it than that Weems murdered Michael Pleasance. What happened was Weems and his partner were supposed to start the shift at the train station at 7 a.m. They arrived late, and the overnight shift guys left, which was in and of itself a violation. There was a fight that broke out that Michael Pleasance and another gentleman were involved in, and it's all on videotape. The whole thing is videotape. Long story short, Alvin Weems shows up. He's not ready to do his job. He doesn't have his uniform on. He doesn't have his radio. Doesn't have his OC spray. So other non-lethal forms of restraint that he could have used. But what he had was a little revolver, which is his side gun. And Michael Pleasance was fighting with somebody else in another part of the station. You can see him on the videotape as Weems has his buddy by the shirt collar. Pleasance is moving closer, and he's talking. You know, he's, according to the witness accounts, you know, using some pretty harsh language at Weems, but not life-threatening language. Weems, seemingly out of nowhere, as Pleasance gets close, pulls out his gun, shoots him in the face, and drops him. All on videotape. Does nothing to provide him any kind of assistance. Doesn't check on him to see if he's still bleeding. It's a cold-blooded murder. And then he lies about it and says he's attacked. We investigated the hell out of that case. I recommended not only that he be terminated, I tried to get the state's attorney's office to prosecute this guy for murder, and I pressed my former colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office to bring civil rights charges against him. Unfortunately, I wasn't successful, but I did maintain that this guy was not fit any longer to be a police officer. And again, I'm telling a little bit on a tale. It was in the investigation finished. Our recommendation was to then Superintendent Klein, just as I was leaving OPS. They held that case until after I left, and then gave him a slap on the wrist for a murder.
Well, before we move on from this, and I'm not discounting anything you just said, but a lot of people wonder, well, how could you work within a system like this? A system that, even by your own description, is embedded within Chicago Police Department. You just described this this horrible shooting, and then this incredibly frustrating and unjust fight that you undertook to try to, address the shooting. Why put up with it? Why work within the system? And of course, we heard even on election night, your opponent say she spent like about 30 seconds thanking her supporters, and then turned to blasting you for having worked in the administrations of Rich Daley and Rahm Emanuel. Why work within the system at OPS and then under Rahm as well?
Because if people like me turn their back on the system and don't try to work from within to change it, it's never going to change. Like the same question you asked me about why was I a federal prosecutor. You want people like me, with my life experience, my sensibilities, to be at the table in these kinds of institutions, to work hard to change it. And frankly, to be blunt, to call bullshit on things that are wrong. If people like me don't stand up and work to challenge the status quo from within, it's never going to change.
I think that's the intrusion of TV. Mike Flannery.
Oh, Flannery's fired up this year, folks.
Put his microphone in. Always treading lightly. Always treading lightly.
This is like a CIA probe here, Flannery.
Flannery. Just barge in, Mike. What the heck? Get yourself at home, all right?
Mike Flannery, everyone. Mike
As long as I'm doing it, let me move this good. This is where the audio's plugged in, and somehow we're not hearing it off your microphone.
Would you like a beer, Mike? A pizza? Anything else we can do? All right. picking up on what Nick was asking, Tony came hard early, and she's coming hard ever since. And one of the things she's saying, well, it's not Tony saying she's a cop. It's a lot of younger activists telling me that I can never vote for Lori Lightfoot because she's a cop. I've heard that so many times. Now, you're now obviously a police officer. I think you're speaking metaphorically, if you understand what I'm saying. You're in law enforcement, so to speak. And what Tony's hammering with you is that you're a corporate lawyer.
God forbid.
And so deal with that. That's sort of her way of asking the same question I was asking, which is, you know, you weren't obviously on the. That's in Tony.
Anybody else want to move the mic?
What else do you want?
I think Antonio, everybody.
Yeah, by this way, is Antonio, right? Antonio was supposed to be here last month. We won't go into that. So she calls you a corporate lawyer, and the sense is, of course, to somehow identify you as somebody who's callous, unfeeling, and doesn't care about people, ordinary working class people in the city of Chicago, taxpayers, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's, I guess, her way of raising the question I did. Well, when I was asking you, where have you been on the front line, so to speak, for the last 8 years, and all the terrible things Iran has done to this city. And
Well, let's just remember, I was probably one of Rahm Emanuel's harshest critics, particularly around police reform and accountability. And unlike Tony, I ran against him.
I can't argue with that one, Lori Lightfoot.
I don't know.
The truth is a simple thing.
We call up the original gangster.
I was going to say, that calls you one of the OGs, the original gangsters. So, there you go.
You and Troy LaRaviere and Willie Wilson. And I think Paul Dallas may have been on that list too. All right, so deal with the corporate lawyer. Is it possible to be a corporate lawyer and still be caring about working class people, middle class people, etc.?
I'm gonna treat that as a serious question.
Okay.
Of course. Look. The notion that Tony Preckwinkle is trying to demonize me for being a successful lawyer is incredible, right? My parents worked hard every single day. My dad working 2 and 3 jobs. My mother working a series of crap jobs for no pay so that their children could have a better life than they did. And I've succeeded. I'm a success story. I should be praised by Tony Preckwinkle, not demonized. My God, there are people that are just like me, coming from environments like mine, who have been successful and are middle and upper middle income black folks that are role models for our children, which is exactly what we should want. And so for somebody to try to tear me down because I have had a measure of success in my life is inconceivable to me. It's foolish and silly. And frankly, I don't think it's going to resonate one bit. And if you look at what I've done in a corporate law firm, like defending a man who was wrongfully convicted of murder, defending an immigrant who was a victim of torture, and on, and using the resources of my law firm to help support the most progressive, the most liberal causes there are in the city. I mean, it's silly that I even have to entertain that discussion. And frankly, it smells like fear to me.
Well, let's talk about the politics of the charge, whether it's real or fair or anything like that. This is politics. We all watched 4 years ago, Chewy pulled Rahm into a runoff election, the first one in Chicago history under this runoff system. And really before Chewy could kind of get going in the runoff phase of the campaign, Rahm had already defined him. He is someone who back in the day voted to raise taxes. He's fiscally irresponsible. He's not prepared to walk into the job and lead from day one. And it sure looks like to us that's what Tony's trying to do, starting off on election night with this tag. So you've just fought back against it here, but you also told us a few minutes ago you're not going to go negative. How are you going to counter this attempt to label you?
What I'm not going to do is try to demonize her personally. That's different. her record is fair game. And we'll have lots of discussions about that, because I think there's a lot of things there that we need to remind people about, and there's a lot of things there that maybe people don't know, and that's fair game. You know, I haven't gotten to where I've gotten in life by letting people walk all over me, and I'm not about to start now. But I think with people, you know, look, we are living in a time when literally every single day we are deluged with nasty, vicious, racist, xenophobic, add every other adjective that you want, coming from a president that frankly, I think most people in this room probably didn't vote for and don't want.
And you're talking about Trump, not President
well, fair point. I'll let you draw those distinctions, right? But in seriousness, I do mean, we get this every single day from Washington. The divisiveness, the hatred, tearing people apart, demonizing people who have a different point of view. What I hear from people out there in the streets is stay positive. Because we want to know what your vision for the future is. And demonizing the other doesn't tell people what you're going to do to solve crime. Demonizing the other doesn't tell people what you're going to do to address our school crisis and our neighborhood schools. It doesn't talk about the needs to lift the burden of oppressive taxes, levies, and fees against people. So I'm going to keep talking about those things that actually matter to people's lives, not all this other nonsense. If she wants to roll around in the mud, have at it, but I'm going to stay where I think people want us to be, which is talking about hope for the future.
Do you think that could win it here? I mean,
I'm 100% confident that it will.
Yeah, because you know, Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high, and look what happened. Donald Trump got elected.
Well, look, I like I said, I'm not going to let somebody turn me into a two-dimensional cardboard figure. That's not happening. Anybody that knows me knows I'm a fighter. I've gotten to where I've gotten, not because somebody handed me something, but because I've fought hard every day to have a seat at the table. And I'm not going to yield the floor to somebody who's going to try to mischaracterize me in any way. That's not happening.
Right.
But I do think people want us to talk about the solutions to the everyday problems and challenges that people are facing in this city.
All right, well, let's get specific about one thing. Before you got here, Tim Tutton, the owner of the Hideout, was encouraging people to storm City Hall this week in opposition to the Lincoln Yard handout. And there's another one too, the 78 handout, which is around it. That's $2.4 billion. Every time I've interviewed you, I've asked you this, whether you're willing to stand up and say, at the very least, hold off on these handouts. They're rushing through the vote on these two deals, these two TIF deals, before Mayoral leaves office. So the next mayor is going to be shackled with them. What can you do? First of all, do you believe they should hold them off?
Yes,
Okay.
I've been very clear about that, and frankly, on my way over here today, I had a long conversation with new zoning chair Jim Kappelman to express to him my urgent plea that he slow this process down.
Well, he could do it very easily by just taking it off the agenda.
That's precisely what I asked him to do. Now, you know, he's going to do what he's going to do. We'll see what happens tomorrow. But we can't have a world in which these mega projects that are going to utterly transform parts of our city, where frankly we're not investing in other parts of the city, that we have no idea what the impact on infrastructure is, what the impact on transportation, schools, the level of density that's being proposed by the Lincoln Yards project alone is something that, frankly, people in this neighborhood whose lives are going to be directly affected on either side of the development haven't had an adequate opportunity to weigh in. And frankly, one of the big issues for me, now today they threw a bone and said, well, you know, instead of 300 affordable housing units, we'll do 600. Not good enough. Not good enough. We have to do better. This is not a decision that should be made now with a lame duck mayor, a lame duck city council. Why can't we wait another month, 6 weeks, to let the new mayor and the new city council really evaluate this project and make sure that there's a level of transparency so people can take their measure of it. This is their tax dollars that we are going to be spending in huge numbers. Why can't we wait and make this project more transparent?
So when you pressed this argument to Kappelman, what was his response?
Well, look, I think he understands it. I'm not the first person that's called him up.
Yeah,
I'm
but
not
you
the
could be
first
the next
person.
mayor. It's one thing for me to call and tell them that. It's one
Here he turns off and calls private, doesn't he?
I turn it forward.
Once you
for me.
stop stalking him, Ben. Look, I think he understood the point. You know, he's in a position that frankly he didn't think he was going to be in until our friend Mr. Solis decided he was going to wear a wire for 2+ years. And look, he's in a fight too, right? He's in a political fight.
Mr. Solis once sat in that very seat.
Yes, he was here on this
Should I
stage.
check for the wire? But,
Flannery, what is this thing?
yeah, right. This is a CIA probe. Let's just
I don't know
be
what
clear.
this thing is. But
No, but I think he understood the point, and I think he is getting a lot of calls from a lot of people saying slow it down, and he himself has said we should slow it down. We'll see if he's got the courage of his convictions.
Well, let me ask you this: the calls that you're getting, there's two sets of calls. There's one from people like the people in this room, activist types, and then there's calls from serious money. There's some serious money behind this thing. Some of them, the wealthiest developers in town. Who knows? We don't even know who their investors are. So, Lori, what I'm asking you, you're mayor of the city of Chicago. Can you say no? Can you resist those powerful forces?
Let's say this thing. Let's do a specific example. Let's say this thing does go through as it's currently scheduled. Is there what if anything could you do if you're elected to go back? Can you undo it? Can you then try to urge the city council to take pass another ordinance to say, hey, we're going to hold this thing up?
Well, it's
what
not like they're getting
position would you be in?
It's not like they're getting a $1.2 billion check in one fell swoop. The allocation of the money is going to come when the new mayor is there. I'm not going to allocate a dime until what needs to be done, the level of transparency, the impact studies actually happen. So they can try, but the ways in which we can slow this thing down.
Well, this is exact opposite of what Mayor Rahm said when he came into office with the parking meter deal, speaking of sessions by these two people on the stage. And he said there was nothing we could do about it. A contract's a contract. We have to honor it. And then he, of course, sealed the deal by
Coming having the city council pass it again.
passing it just to make sure. Are you confident that there's things that you could do as mayor to prevent this? Not just this one, but the other one that he wants to do at 78, these giant, and I guess Cop Academy as well. All these deals that are being rushed through in the lame duck session.
Yeah, I feel pretty confident. I mean, I have spent 30 years as a lawyer, so.
Okay, that corporate lawyer stuff's coming in handy. I'm going to use it on the other way.
I was going to say, have you considered the motto, what we need now is a corporate lawyer?
There's an idea. Now more than ever.
All right, let's talk about some other pressing issues. The schools. Toni Prickle, one of the things she said is that she would keep Superintendent or CEO, Jackson, as the head of the schools. What's your position on that?
Well, look, I come at this from this fact. We've had 5 CEOs at CPS in the last 7 years. No system can thrive with that level of instability. There are questions that I have about Janice Jackson's leadership. I'm very concerned about the way in which she handled the CPS sex abuse scandal that broke last June as school was on the eve of letting out for the summer. So, but I think fairly, one, I'm not the mayor. I don't think it's appropriate for any of us to add instability to a system that frankly desperately needs it. If I become the mayor, one of the things that's going to be important to me is sit down with her to make sure that we share the same values and that we are going to be able to work cooperatively together. Now, of course, I'm aware of the fact that Rob gave her a golden parachute contract as well. We'll see if that stands. But more importantly, I think we've got to signal to our kids, to our parents, frankly to the bond markets, that we want to have a healthy, thriving CPS. It's not only important for our education system. If we don't have a strong neighborhood school system, we are never going to have the kind of economic development lift that we must have. It's central to uplifting the quality of life in our neighborhoods. So that's what I'm focused on. The stability matters. I'm not guaranteeing anything, but I think it would be highly inappropriate for me at this point to say yay or nay when I haven't had the opportunity to sit down and have a substantive conversation with her, and particularly in the middle of the school year.
Tell the parents out there, as well of course as the taxpayers out there, why you're qualified to be a leader on education here. We spent like the first half hour, 20 minutes, whatever, talking about your record on criminal justice, police accountability. That's obviously taken up a large part of your resume in public life. What about education and some of these other issues? How are you ready to lead from day one?
Well, look, I've spent a lot of time, as I have on every issue, before we put out our comprehensive education policy, really listening, going to listen to parents, listen to teachers, principals, other stakeholders in the system. CPS is probably one of the most studied institutions in our city, from the academy to parent groups and everything else in between. So I've had a lot of time listening and understanding and reading and digesting a significant amount of information and data related to CPS. I'm a public school kid myself. I care deeply about making sure that we create real opportunity in every neighborhood for kids who frankly are growing up in families just like mine. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm the education expert, but I know a lot about it, and I'm going to make sure that I have a team around me, both at CPS, in the mayor's office, who understands the necessity of having the best quality public education system that we possibly can, because it's so critically important to make sure that we are not losing another generation of our kids. So I feel very comfortable that we will be able to assemble a team that speaks the values that frankly are going to reflect the lived experience of people in the city, to really use our public education system to add jet fuel to changing and transforming our neighborhoods.
You know, one of the complaints I've heard from all the years, the last 8 years or so, is that from parents and students at the public schools, is that whenever there's money that's really needed for the public schools, they can't find it. But they can always find money for this development deal or that development deal. Now you're going to be, if you're the mayor of the city of Chicago, you're going to be facing many pressing financial deadlines, obligations, pension payments, etc. Folks are feeling overtaxed as it is.
Right.
How are you going to find the money to finance a public school system that we really need and deserve?
Well, I frankly think the changes that were made in Springfield a couple years ago have really put us on a very solid path. As you know, we were really constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul. We couldn't do any kind of, frankly, one-year budgeting was difficult, and let alone impossible to do multi-year budgeting. We now have a funding formula that I think adds stability, financial stability, to the system in a way that we haven't seen in quite a long time. So I think that gives us some breathing room if we manage our resources in the right way. I'm very focused on what do we need to do to make sure that in those classrooms we have the right support for our kids to have an opportunity to thrive. We've got to improve the quality of those neighborhood schools. That's why I've said let's have a moratorium on charters right now. That's why I've said we've got to return nurses and librarians and counselors back to our schools. That's where we've got to focus our attention. Obviously, I'm mindful of the fact that the CTU contract is going to be up, but that's got to be thought of in the context of a larger mission and plan to focus on our classrooms.
By the way, speaking of the teachers' contracts coming up, CTU has endorsed your opponent, you know that. Are you going to be, how do I put this? Are you going to be able to overlook that when you, if say, become mayor? Or are you going to be Rom-like in your desire to reap vengeance?
Ben, you harm me mortally by comparing me to Rom.
So you won't take the approach of sitting down for a conversation and start off by saying "fuck you."
No, I'm not going to lead with my middle finger. No, look. Obviously, the CTU, and we have to give a lot of credit to Karen Lewis, has built itself into a venerable and important institution in our city. There's no question about it. And look, I'm not that kind of gal. I'm obviously mindful of the fact that they've supported Tony. I'm mindful of the fact that they're helping her fill out the level of criticism against me. But, you know, look, I think about this as individual teachers who got into the teaching profession because they care about kids. I think about this as the parents who desperately need to feel like they are heard and have a voice. You know, we haven't talked about this yet, but there's been a lot of harm done over the last 7 years to parents and teachers and other people who have to be part of the ecosystem of our public education system because of the way in which tough decisions were made. You know, closing 50 schools wasn't bad enough. It's the way in which it was done and a level of disrespect, frankly, that was shown that all those stakeholders. The closing of NTA, I've spent a lot of time with the families in that school, and I still don't get that one. The closing of the high schools in Inglewood. You know, as my mother would say, there's always a right way and a wrong way to do everything. We have not respected parents in making tough decisions about one of the most important things that a parent does, which is trust their children to a public education system. So I think one of the most important things I can do as a mayor, if I'm fortunate enough to get there, is frankly heal the wounds and reach out to parents and bring them back into the conversation where they should be. They should be welcome partners, not unwanted guests.
How would you do that, and how would you stay in touch with people out in the city's neighborhoods? Because as you're alluding to here, in addition to Ram's policies, which often were very unpopular, his persona, the way he did things, people just never felt like he was one of them. He was Mayor 1%. They harped on the fact that he went to high school in Wilmette, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You, like me, are not from Chicago. How do you convince people you're one of them, that you can understand where they're coming from, that you can lead them?
Well, I've lived here for 32 years.
But you still can't claim you're from Chicago.
Well, I think I can. And this is my home. This is where I'm raising my child. This is where I tend to be for the balance of my life. I'm in this because I love my city. I'm in this because I want to make sure that people all over the city feel like they have a stake in its future. I mean, that's critically important to me. So I understand there's a lot of cynicism out there. Those cross currents have been blowing for some time, not just in Chicago, but really all over the country. And certainly those are the winds, I think, that brought us Donald Trump. So I'm very cognizant of the fact that as a leader in this city, win or lose on April 2nd, I have responsibility to talk about hope, talk about the future, talk about opportunity, and reach out to people all over the city to try to bring people together. That's what I've been attempting to do since I announced in May of 18. That's what I will continue to do as the next mayor of the city.
I want to ask one other thing, and then I think we're going to open up some questions. A certain journalist named Ben, who's sitting at this table, once wrote a story that described Tony Preckwinkle as utterly humorless. Are you confident that you are funnier than Tony Preckwinkle?
I won't say the first thing that came to mind, but I'll just say yes.
All right, let's get some questions from the audience here. How we're going to do this? Is Tim around? I think we're going to try to pass the microphone.
Or you can just speak loudly.
Or people can speak, I guess, yeah.
It's in the corner.
Yeah. I know where the mic is. I'm just trying to figure out how to hand it around efficiently. Great idea. All right, I'm going to call it.
All right.
Got a question.
Let's see. Oh, there's Timmy T right there.
Thanks, Tim.
Man, the myth, the legend.
All right, you ready for first question?
Yes, let's go.
Okay, here we go.
Hi, so I'm reading her. The last time I was here and we were talking about the mayoral candidates, we had to kind of like push you guys into talking about them. And Lori was like kind of a blip that she wasn't talked about very much. So how surprised are you two about the election results?
But you got Lori Lightfoot up here, you're asking us a question?
She's putting you on Front Street, man.
Well, I'll be the first to answer this one. I did not have her in the pool. I'll be honest with you, Lori Lightfoot. I was predicting that it would be a Tony Preckwinkle versus Bill Daley. So I was with Maya. Maya's here somewhere. There she is. Hello. Anyway, that she's hiding over there. And we were doing the election night coverage from the Reader, live from the Reader office. I couldn't believe, I'll be honest with you, Lori, you caught me off guard with that one. And so I did not expect
Not
it.
the first time somebody's underestimated Mick Ben.
So I did not predict it, all right? I lost money on this election, Lori Lightfoot.
I kept laughing because in the run-up to last Tuesday, there were all these stories quoting political analysts who kept saying, including David Axelrod, who, many of us respect, of course, for all of his work, but, I kept going back to David Axelrod, who do you think's going to be in it? And he's like, oh, Daley and Preckwinkle. And I'm just thinking, I saw the same poll you did, okay? That's what the polls were all saying, right? So, to me, it was like, as a former competitive swimmer, the slow people were in the outside lanes, and the people who had the fastest times were seated on the inside. And then we always called it outside heat when somebody from lane 6 came in and won the race. That's kind of what it seemed like to me. Now, I was often in lane 6 and I never won the race, but it does happen.
Well, no, Lori, this it just pops in my mind because like I said, we had Willie Wilson on the show today, and your victory came primarily. Your strongest vote came on the North Lakefront, on the north side, among white voters. Willie Wilson won most of the black wards, and Tony Preckwinkle won some on the near south side. So what are you going to do to get outreach that can convince black voters, Willie Wilson voters, that they should vote for you? The last time we faced this situation in 2015, the Willie Wilson voters went with Rahm. All right. Again, they didn't go with Chewy Garcia. They went with Rahm Emanuel. So how is it going to be different this time around with you?
Well, I mean, even in those wards where I didn't win, I was competitive. And look, I think in some ways this slate gets wiped clean. And the differences between me and Tony Preckwinkle couldn't be more stark. Tony represents the old, broken political machine. And she is the head of that political machine. She is the person who is associated most closely with Burke and Barrios, and I'm not part of any of that. And what I hear from voters before the election, when we were feeling the surge, and what I've heard very clearly from people since last Tuesday, is they want change. I think we saw that in polling early on. That people felt like the city was going in the wrong direction, that they really want to change. I think what last Tuesday's election told those people is that change is actually possible. And so we're going to keep bringing that message of change, bring the message of a government that is more independent, that is more accountable and transparent, and that we have to do a significant course correction if we are going to improve the fortunes of people all over the city.
So you're not in any way intimidated by the prospects of having to administrate this huge, enormous city with all these complex problems, financial problems. Reporters like Mike Flannery are going to be asking you hard questions all the time with their huge microphones. You're not intimidated by that in any way?
No, I mean, if I was, I wouldn't have jumped in. I mean, again, I jumped in against Goliath. I jumped in against Rahm, right? Rahm, who was probably...
He's kind of a small Goliath.
Oh, but he was, Rahm had $15 million against Chewy. He was well on his way to a $40 million bank account, right? To run, wasn't going to be, having more Rahm wasn't going to help him. The money was going to go to, frankly, tear down and savage anybody who had the audacity to run against him. And he tried mightily. So I'm not afraid of the challenge. Frankly, I was afraid of standing on the sideline and what the future would hold if people like me didn't jump in. So I'm relishing the opportunity.
See, that's a mistake you make, asking Ben to answer the question instead of Lori. There you go.
Monroe Anderson, ladies and gentlemen.
Hey, Lori.
How you doing, sir?
Okay, how are you?
Good.
Okay, one criticism or one concern that I've heard is that Tony has experience running this operation, this entity, a big company basically, multi-billion-dollar company, and that you don't have that experience. Is that a disadvantage for you?
Well, I'll push back on the assumption of your question.
Okay.
I help run the police department, the city's 911 center, and I help fix the broken city's procurement department. I've been a senior equity partner in one of the largest law firms in the world, helping CEOs and other C-suite executives solve very complicated and complex problems, and frankly, keeping them out of the news. So I think I've got a bevy of experience, and frankly, if Toni Preckwinkle wants to put her record up against mine, I'll have that conversation all day long.
Hey Lori, I think many people in this room are CTA riders, have been on CTA actually, and curious to hear about your plans for CTA and making it more equitable and sustainable for the city.
Well, I'm concerned about the CTA because frankly ridership is down, and we are not in an environment where Washington DC is looking to provide the kind of resources that are necessary to make the CTA viable. So I think that is going to be one of the major challenges that we face. I think we've got to get ridership up. It's important for the system. Frankly, it's important for the environment. I'm very concerned about the proliferation of the tens of thousands of additional cars that are on our streets because of rideshare. Not only the wear and tear on the roads, but frankly, pollution and frankly, traffic safety issues. So these are things, and I refer you to our transportation policy, but these are things that we have to focus on, and the CTA is critically important. We've got to have people have transportation options that they can get to and from work and school, and we can't have the CTA system collapse, and I'm worried about this pretty significant downtick in ridership.
You're thinking of putting some kind of limitations or cut the number of rideshare cars we have out there?
Look, we have to think about what's going on with the rideshare. Right now, it's a completely unregulated certain situation. It's crushed our taxi cab industry, and frankly, in a way that's unfair. I mean, it's created this market where the taxi cab industry can't compete. The medallions are essentially worthless. You know, I ride in cabs, and I hear from cab drivers, certainly once they recognize who I am, who give me an earful about really how difficult it is for them to earn a living now. You know, they've sunk substantial amount of their life savings and their kids' future in these taxis, and they can't earn a living now. And if you've noticed, at peak times, the number of taxis that are out on the street keeps dropping and dropping and dropping. And I think that's a significant issue. And frankly, we have people coming in to the city and to ride shares that don't even live in Chicago, don't even live in Illinois. And we have to address that issue. New York, I think, is ahead of us. I'm thinking creatively about how to address it. So we've got to look to the experience of other cities, but it's absolutely something we've got to look at.
Do you have a Uber or Lyft app in your phone?
I do.
Okay, just so you take both. All right.
I do.
Do you ride the CTA yourself?
Yeah.
I do. I'm 4 blocks away from the Logan Square line, so I ride the CTA from time to time.
All right, another question?
Lori, there are those that would argue that you're a progressive, obviously. A lot of people think that Toni Preckwinkle is a progressive. She's already the president of the county board. If she is not the president of the county board and she defeats you, it's likely that John Daly will emerge as the president of the Cook County Board. How important is that knowledge to communicate to voters the strategic importance of selecting you over Toni Preckwinkle?
Well, there's a little, yes, of course, as only Bruce would do.
It's sort of like if you remove Nixon, Spiro Agnew.
Well, I don't think that possibility is lost on some sophisticated voters. And there's a thing going around Facebook that says, wouldn't it be great if Toni Preckwinkle remained the president of the Cook County Board and Lori Lightfoot became our next mayor? Which of course I favor.
So spread the rumor.
Yeah.
It's a free country.
it's great that you talked about the misconduct by Officer Wings, and that was an especially egregious case of officer misconduct. But there was also another egregious case, Dante Servin, and I was wondering if you could talk about your involvement with that case as well.
Yeah, Dante Servin, as you know, killed Rakia Boyd by recklessly shooting over his shoulder over a petty dispute over noise. That, I'll call it murder, happened years before I was involved with the Chicago Police Board. The case languished for way too long in the Cook County criminal courts. As I think you all know, the judge there in a bench trial acquitted Dante Servin on an explanation that made no sense to me. The case then came back to IPRA for investigation. I frankly thought they took way too long. I got involved in the police board in July of 15 while that case was still pending before the police board. My recollection is that while that case was still pending with IPRA. IPRA made its recommendation to terminate Dante Servin because they believed that the shooting was unjustified. Gary McCarthy was still the superintendent. I think that case came to him in like September. He took a full 90 days. And the case finally came to the police board, I want to say in like late December of 15. We were set to try Dante Servin in early May of 16. And right before, literally the day before that case was supposed to be tried before the police board, Dante Servin quit. So there's this narrative out there that I delayed, I did this. The truth is, the case was in front of the police board for under 6 months. We expeditiously moved it through the process, and we're literally on the eve of trying that case. Because the case had such public interest, I made arrangements with Chief Judge Tim Evans to have a courtroom in the Daly Center that could accommodate a larger crowd than I expected would be coming. And then, as I said, literally the day before the gavel would have struck on that case, Dante Servin resigned. So, and once obviously an officer resigns, the police board has no jurisdiction, remaining jurisdiction over the case. So I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm happy to clarify that we never had the opportunity to take any real substantive action in the case of Dante Servin. I'm pretty clear where I would have come out.
Lori, a follow-up question on that. One of the criticisms of you that we've heard is that family and supporters of Rakia Boyd and of other people who have been shot and killed by police feel like you shut them down when they appeared at the police board and tried to speak out or tried to push the case along, tried to protest, whatever they had to say, that that your insistence on certain kind of decorum effectively shut them down and they didn't get to express their views.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. I can remember Martinez Sutton, who is Rakia Boyd's brother, coming and talking in very passionate terms before the police board. And we tried to give him and other victims' families, like the daughters of Betty Jones, a lot of opportunity to come and express themselves in front of the police board. Now look, we live in a time where frankly FOP and its lawyers were looking for any advantage that they possibly could have to demonstrate that their cases weren't being fairly tried before the police board. Again, I'm a lawyer. I'm very cognizant of making sure that at the police board, we didn't do anything before a case came before us to suggest in any way that we were putting our thumb on the scale at all. And that meant, frankly, that we would receive the information for cases that weren't in front of us, like the Rakia Boyd case, like the Betty Jones case, in a dispassionate way, because I didn't want to do anything that if we were going to terminate these officers, having heard the evidence, that a lawyer for the FOP could say, well, at this police board meeting, President Lightfoot basically MF'd my client and made it look like she had already made up her mind before the case would ever get there. That's what lawyers do. They try to find the advantage, they try to find the thing that can advance their client's case. And again, I'm a very experienced trial lawyer. I know all the tricks of the trade, and we had a lot of conversations at the police board level to make sure that we were doing our job as the fair arbiter of these cases. I had a lot of conversations with the family members, with representatives of the family members, to make sure that they were getting heard as those cases were moving through the process, that they were getting the notifications that they should be making. If you look at the police board record, when those family members would come, or frankly average citizens that were coming and saying, hey, I got a problem on my block, you're going to see the record that I would say, hey, superintendent, hey, first deputy, hey, COPA, hey, IPRA, whoever it was, making sure that those families were getting the relief from the system that they deserve to have. So I know that that's a narrative that's out there. I think if you view the videotape, if you look at the transcripts, you're going to find a much more nuanced and different circumstance, particularly with respect to me.
Lori, that's a strong narrative across the board on any mayoral appointed body. The school board is exhibit A of this. That blank, passive face, which it's the first time I've ever heard this interpretation, that it's to show that you're completely and utterly objective as though you're a judge. But many parents going for the school board talk about what the same attitudes that they have, that the relatives of people who've been killed by police officers have when they go for the police board. It's like there's no heart there, there's no feeling, there's no empathy. They don't care, and that is the heart of so much cynicism that people have about the city of Chicago.
Well, first of all, the police board is a court, right? It's an administrative court. It's different than the Board of Education, and I can't speak to that. But what I can say is this: I have such a clear recollection of Betty Jones's daughters coming to speak at the next police board meeting after she was killed for basically being a good Samaritan. Those young women were broken. I mean, just broken. They could barely speak for the grief that they were experiencing. You can't witness that without having a profound experience and impact on you. Frankly, I talked to Martinez Sutton, Rakia Boyd's brother, recently. Spent an hour on the phone with him very recently. And he's in a slightly better place than he was, several years ago. But there's always going to be a hole in his heart and his soul because of the way in which his sister was murdered and the fact that the family really hasn't gotten any notion of justice from our system. Dante, frankly, cowardly quit before he could face the disciplinary system before the police board. The criminal justice system failed that family. So, I have a brother who has been in the criminal justice system for most of his adult life. I know firsthand the devastation that feels from a family who is suffering as a result of circumstances that feel way beyond your control and where your faith is tested because of what happens. So all I can say is, when those folks come before a board like the police board and are pouring out their heart and soul, there's not a single one of my police board members while I was there who wasn't deeply and profoundly affected by bearing witness to that kind of pain. And frankly, it made us even more resolved to make sure that we did our jobs fairly and the right way, and with written explanation of why we were ruling in the way that we were ruling, to make sure that we were doing justice.
Time for one more.
I'm hesitant to change the subject after that, but I think a lot of what you've been talking about tonight are priorities that are very expensive. The kind of training that is needed for the police department, the kind of shift in development to the neighborhoods, the infusion of a major infusion of cash and change at the Board of Education. All these things that you talk about are expensive at a time when our city has still very serious financial problems. How do you think you can reallocate the funds we have, balance? It's a form of what Ben asked earlier. We don't want any higher taxes, although we expect that we'll get some if we're realistic. But how do you, I think one of the mistakes Ron made to focus so much on the money is to not give the things to the neighborhoods that were needed in communities to move schools forward and to reform the police department, these other things. How do you do those things while balancing the budget?
Well, I think you embedded in your question is the answer. It's a question of priorities. You know, we're going to spend $1.2 billion on a development. Frankly, it's going to be developed no matter what. Whether we put a nickel into Lincoln Yards, this is some of the most valuable real estate in our city. It's going to be developed anyway, right? We have TIF dollars that are intended to restore blighted areas, and we're not spending the money, and we're declaring TIF surpluses in TIF districts all over the city where people are starving for resources. We're talking about frankly in the police department, we're spending $50 to $60 million every single year, and that doesn't include the blockbuster cases on police settlements, judgments, and misconduct, over $500 million over the last 7 years. That, by the way, we go into the bond market and we borrow with our terrible credit rating. So for me, yes, we absolutely are going to have a serious question about revenue. But before we do that, we must demonstrate to taxpayers in the city that we hear them, that we understand that they feel like they're nickel and dimed, that they're overwhelmed by regressive taxes, and we have to demonstrate to them that we're going to be better fiscal stewards than what we've seen in certainly the last 7 years and maybe even a longer time before that. We have money for the things that we value. We have money for the things that are a priority. And all I'm talking about is truly a reallocation and really a reprioritization of the things that are important for us. If our neighborhoods are starving, if those communities continue to be left behind, that's not cost-free. We're paying for it every single day.
Okay, I think we're going to have to end it there. I'm told we're out of time. Lori, we have lots more questions. We look forward to hearing you answer them over the next few weeks. Can we, whatever you are planning to do in the mayor's race, can we have a round of applause for Lori for coming out? Thank you very much. Thanks for the time. And thanks to all of you for coming out. Thanks to you for being engaged and interested. Everybody stay plugged in for the next month. Get all your neighbors plugged in. This is important stuff.